by Joseph Tainter. Joseph Tainter, perhaps what is most intriguing in the evolution of human societies is the regularity with which the pattern of increasing complexity is interrupted by collapse. Now, I don't have time to get into the whole theoretical foundations of his statement, but I can say that the symptoms of collapse that are identified in his book are corruption at the top, rigidity of the governance structure, increasing, diminishing returns to investment in just about everything. These are all problems plaguing the modern world today. But business as usual is taking us in one direction. Rising demand, diminishing supply of energy, minerals, fish stocks, etc., competition for capital, unrepayable debt, and increasing costs for everything will create a situation in which economies, one by one, turn south following the path of Egypt, Syria, Greece, and so on and so forth. Or we can confront the possibility, if that doesn't happen, of accelerating climate change and ecological degradation, which herald a period of uneconomic growth. Here's a concept for you. We think of economic growth. What is uneconomic growth? It's growth in which the damage costs exceed the benefits. Now, if you've been plotting, as insurance companies do, the damage costs of extreme climate events, you'll see that it's now in the regularly tens of billions of dollars per event. And there's dozens and dozens of other costs that go unmonitored by our kind of economy. We measure the benefits, not even very well, in a silly index called GNP, but we don't measure the costs by and large. What was the cost of the collapse of the North Atlantic cod stock? Nobody bothered to really figure it out. What's the cost of the extinction of species? Well, we don't really know until the whole system goes down. But the point is, you can imagine a system in which the costs exceed the benefits, and at that point, growth is uneconomic. This is the upward tick of carbon dioxide that I mentioned earlier. We've touched 400 parts per million just a year ago. This is the highest level that it has been for tens of millions of years. It's been a 42% increase in just this century. This is the primary driver of the uptick in temperature. Now, you'll notice periods of seeming plateau or even a decline in temperature. That's because the oceans do a flip. There's something called the North Pacific Decadal Oscillation, for example. We happen to be in a cold water phase right now. So we're into that overshoot in just about every dimension you all know about. Climate change, so I'll mention it. For the first 13 years of this century include 12 of the warmest 14 years in the instrumental record. Extremely hot weather events have increased by a factor of 50 compared to the decades before 1980. These are real numbers. Again, nobody's making this up. Other weather extremes are increasing in frequency and intensity. Recent findings, even climate scientists are beginning to panic because they're not being paid attention to. I'm a scientist. I literally took a whole course in which we were urged never to engage in politics. Your goal as a scientist is to produce data. It's not up to you to interpret the social and economic meaning of those data. That is beginning to break down because the scientists are getting frightened with the results of their analyses. Two of the most outspoken are Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes at the Tyndall Institute in the UK. So they argued that this really requires degrowth, a planned economic recession. Those are their exact words. The Western world should be engaged in a planned economic recession. We've got the wealth to do it and feed and clothe everybody in the process to ease our way down, a soft landing as opposed to the crash that might. This is just a curve showing the idea of uneconomic growth. As the economy grows with increasing production and consumption, the x-axis, then the marginal utility of growth, that is to say the benefits will decline over time because the next unit of growth isn't nearly as important as the early units, but the costs increase. And we're seeing increasing costs now every time you open a newspaper. At some point, the costs exceed or cross the benefits. That's the optimal scale. No point in growing further. Problem, the benefits are going over here, the costs are being imposed over there, and those guys over here are the ones making the decisions. And hence, we're now in a situation where the poor and impoverished are really not in a political position to do very much about it. Even the World Bank has caught up. one of the great promoters of growth and development, a couple of years ago has come out with a major study. You can look it up, it's online. The projected 4-degree warming cannot be allowed to occur. They don't go as far as degrowth, but they believe that we're in big trouble. Despite all of these warnings, despite the World Bank report, despite, this is the pattern of use of fossil fuels. It's a continuous upward trend. And we show no hesitation whatsoever in continuing in our use of fossil fuels. Just look at BC and Canada as perfect examples of economies promoting the exploitation and development of fossil fuels. The Kyoto Protocol, which was one of the great signal treaties to reverse this trend, there's no obvious effect if it's ever having been implemented. So in the aggregate, we're not anywhere near the point where we can think of replacing fossil fuel, in which case this may be the future scenario. Not a continuous increase, but in fact a peaking and decline beginning about now. And in fact, the economy is in an undulating plateau. And it's because energy production is in an undulating plateau. And every time the economy starts to tick up, costs go up, or rather energy consumption goes up, so costs go up and suppresses the economy again. We may have seen the end of growth whether we like it or not. I've already implied that there's something special about the human species. And it's our capacity as a species that has, I'm going to say, four unique qualities. There's several, but I think the important ones are high intelligence. And by high intelligence, I mean the capacity to reason from the evidence. Okay? It's the capacity to reason logically based on what we know. Another quality of human beings is the capacity to plan ahead. No other species on Earth has the capacities associated with high intelligence or the ability to plan ahead, to use the product of reasoning to change the future. Okay? We also have the capacity to be moral beings, to distinguish right from wrong. I assert it is wrong in a planet of plenty for 1 billion people to be constantly plagued by the disease and ill nourishment of poverty when there's another 1 billion people who are excessively endowed with wealth and capital and all the rest of it. That's a moral judgment call, but no other species can make it. We also have other qualities that we share with other species, but uniquely available to us in intensity, and that's empathy and sympathy for other species and other people, should we choose to exercise them. Now, I raise these 4 qualities because I want you to think about which of them do you see in evidence in, for example, British Columbia's current economic development policy based on the exploitation of fossil fuels and exports into world markets. Which of these qualities do you see exercised by our federal government in Ottawa as it shuts down our research libraries, muzzles our scientists, and essentially keeps the Canadian public in ignorance of our own scientific knowledge about the state of the economy, the state of the nation, and so on and so forth. So we have a real problem here of cognitive dissonance. We're going in a place in our minds which is remote from the real world. So the question is, are we going to go into a planned degrowth or something else? Now, in theory, we can manage this, and I've already mentioned these unique qualities of human beings: high intelligence, the capability to plan ahead, to exercise moral judgment, and so on and so forth. But we're not anywhere near using even ideas that came out 150 years ago with John Stuart Mill, who talked about the stationary state economy. He hoped that we'd reach the point very soon, and this is going back to the middle part of the 19th century, at which no further growth would be necessary, because people would have sufficiency to simply enjoy life. What's the point of growing beyond that? He even made an ecological connection. He saw further growth as destroying the beauty of the planet, the ecological basis of existence, 150 years ago when the economy was a fraction of what it is today, 10% or less, I would imagine. So the problem is that all our contemporary variants, the steady state economy, the degrowth initiative, the kind of language we're using is already 150 years old, and yet it penetrates nowhere into the public policy domain. Why no action? Well, I love this cartoon. Humans are spatial and temporal discounters. Those are my words, but the cartoon is perfect, okay? We favor the here and now over other places and future generations. We're behaviorally conservative. We don't like to change when we're in comfortable positions. There's good neuropsychological and cognitive reasons for this we haven't got time to get into. But worse, this is the new age of unreason. We have entered the endarkenment, a period, seriously, of deliberate misinformation to disabuse people of the idea that we have a problem. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent, have been spent, and tens of millions more every year to deny climate, to deny evolution, to deny science. Our own government in Ottawa, shutting down libraries, muzzling scientists, firing half the scientific capacities of our major science departments. It's insane that we put up with it. Remember, where's that high intelligence?
Of information. So David Orr would argue that we may actually be losing the intelligence we need to live equitably and sustainably on the planet. So our minds are filled with more information now than ever before. Apparently there's more new information in a Sunday issue of the Times, New York Times, than a person ever encountered during their entire life at the turn of the last century. So Bill's example too, you could live your whole life and nothing new would happen. Today, it's happening every second, it's accelerating. And yet we're not necessarily getting any wiser. We're certainly not exercising the kind of intelligence we would need to increase our social caring capability, to look out for one another in a collaborative environment, in a sharing economy.
Human beings are programmed to prefer and act upon a reassuring lie rather than to understand the inconvenient truth. I hope much of what I'm talking about is penetrating, and I hope it's true. I mean, I may be wrong, but I don't think so, based on the material evidence out there. So we need to act on that. So the bottom line is really quite simple. In coming years, listen to this, in coming years, the human enterprise will likely contract. We're already perhaps in that plateau leading to contraction. But as an intelligent, forward-looking, plan-capable moral species, we can theoretically, understanding something of our own behavior, choose between business as usual, that's what our governments are urging us to do, which would risk, in my view, a chaotic implosion of the economy, imposed by nature, dramatic climate change, collapses of ecosystems, which we're seeing one by one, bit by bit around the planet. The cod stocks are just one example. Or economic upheaval followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars. If we actually run out of fossil fuels and we're in a competitive scramble for the last mineral deposits, China is already embargoing the exports of key industrial minerals. If this reaches a critical point, we will see the chaotic implosion of global geopolitics to the point where any reasonable approach to this problem becomes impossible. The option is degrowth, a well-planned, orderly, cooperative descent toward a socially just sustainability for all. A recent study just 2 weeks ago was published, partly funded by NASA. It became very controversial. NASA actually had nothing to do with it. They did fund this study, but it's on the collapse and the likelihood of collapse of our current society. They concluded it can be avoided and population can reach equilibrium within the means of nature if the per capita rate of depletion of nature is reduced to a sustainable level and if resources are distributed in a reasonably equitable fashion. That's almost a mock-up of the definition of degrowth that I talked about right at the outset. So that's the situation as I see it. Thank you very much.